From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South.
Welcome to Take on the South, the podcast of the Institute for Southern Studies at the University of South Carolina. I'm Matt Simmons, the Assistant Director of the Institute, and your host for today. In 1915, D.W. Griffith directs the first great American film, The Birth of a Nation, which Jeffrey Galt Harpham, a previous guest here on the podcast, has called the most despised cultural artifact ever produced in America. American film has thus been born, if you will, with a Southern story. A fantasy of a world, only recently passed away in 1915. A quarter century later, American film comes to its maturity with what remains one of the grandest spectacles ever to appear on the screen, Gone with the Wind. Thus, Hollywood's golden age is bookended by two very different Southern fantasies. But such fantasies do not stop in 1939. They continue down to our own day, with cinema and television continuing to shape our perceptions of South. The South on screen is our topic today, and joining me are two guests that have been with me here before. We have Jeff Rogers, Professor of History at Gordon State College in Georgia, and Robert Dean Lurie, music critic and author. Longtime listeners will have heard both of these guests with us before on our really great Southern Rock episode, which if you haven't heard, go in the back catalog, check that out. There's a lot of great stuff there. But join us today to round out the panel for today is Sean Busick, a full professor of history at Athens State College in Athens and Decatur, Alabama. So, gentlemen, I'll just throw it to you in this way. So much of how we think about the South is shaped by what we see on the small screen, the big screen, what Hollywood has produced for us. So each of y'all has your own connections to the South. Each of y'all is a Southerner in your own way. What presentation of the South on screen sticks out as particularly memorable to you, especially as in your boyhood you were beginning to understand yourself as a Southerner?
From growing up, when I grew up, I distinctly remember movies like Smokey and the Bandit. That came out when I was about 6-7 years old, and I distinctly remember going to the theater with my parents. We actually had to take a shower and put on our best clothes because that was movie etiquette back then.
How about that?
I remember standing in line to get tickets. It was a huge, huge thing. I have come to learn that might have very much been a regional appeal. I don't know if other parts of the country were as attracted to that movie as it was in my corner of the South at the time. Although that movie has certainly been a kind of cult success over the years. So I think it resonated with a lot of people just because it's, outlandishly funny. So
Yes.
I recall going to the movie, much like Jeff did. It was a real big deal when we were kids, which I suppose shows our age. We didn't have nearly as easy access to films as everyone does today. If we wanted to see a movie, we couldn't just, call up Netflix. We couldn't even, pop in a VHS when we were kids. It involved going out. And I grew up in a small town. We had one movie theater. And you had to dress up to go out to see the movie. You had to plan ahead. Growing up in a small town in Indiana, I would say that the appeal of Smokey and the Bandit was probably a lot more than regional. One of my earliest childhood fantasies was about being able to grow up and get a black Trans Am with a big, flaming chicken on the hood.
I mean, you still can, Sean. I'm sure this dream can be realized.
Yeah.
What about you, Rob? When you were growing up, what do you remember you remember watching Smokey and the Bandit? Is there some other great evocation of the South on screen that you remember shaping your own sort of boyhood fantasies?
Yeah, and this question is especially important for me because I didn't grow up in the South. I had, as I mentioned on the last podcast, I had family connections in the South. I had one set of grandparents in North Carolina and one in Mississippi. My parents went to University of Mississippi, and my dad was born in North Carolina, but I was actually raised in Minneapolis. So really, technically, I'm a Midwesterner. I guess technically I'm a Californian because that's where I was born. But so Hollywood, I don't think always understands the responsibility they have here. Because so for someone like me, the idea of the South was a combination of some family connections, stories primarily from my dad about Ole Miss, and then these movies and shows. And so, it's kind of an alternate reality of the South because, the Hollywood South, of course, is not the South. So for me, my first memories were a network showing of Gone with the Wind, which we videotaped and would rewatch occasionally. And then reruns of, and I guess not just reruns, but actual sort of on-time screenings of The Dukes of Hazzard, because that show was ongoing at the time. And then actually, while you guys were talking, I just remembered too that there was this miniseries called The Blue and the Gray. And, I think most people remember the Patrick Swayze North and South miniseries, but for whatever reason in my household, The Blue and the Gray was the one that we all latched onto. And so that was kind of that and Gone with the Wind were forming a Hollywoodized version of the Civil War. And then lastly, a little bit later, there was this movie that I'm sure y'all remember called Mississippi Burning. And so that was the negative side, right? And that was kind of, I remember, I don't know if it was my dad or my grandpa kind of grousing about how this movie was one-sided or too negative. Now I did latch onto the Gene Hackman character. I believe his character is Southern. So I kind of latched onto it. I was like, well, there's one Southern good guy in this, but that's a pretty brutal movie and depicting a really brutal topic, right? So that's a different view. And I guess that was Hollywood trying to offer a corrective, maybe their own atonement, thinking that they had over romanticized the region. So yeah, all of those things kind of formed a stew. And then once I actually moved to the South at 18, then I had a job of reconciling what was in front of me with these images that had kind of fueled a part of my childhood.
Rob, I really like this notion about reconciling reality and images, but there's one thing that you said, and I think it's interesting that everybody initially went to those late 70s, early 80s cultural products there, these Hollywood presentations of the South, Hollywood's making of the South. It's interesting at that point in time, this point in time where everyone's beginning there with Smokey and the Bandit, Dukes of Hazzard, etc. But around the time we're talking about here, the late 1970s, after Jim Crow is over, the South has become, referencing back to our Southern Rock conversation, this moment in time where Jeff says, I think very correctly, the South in the late 70s was cool, it was hip, it was sexy, it was rebellious, it was all those things. But this is the point in time in which Walker Percy, somewhere, there's an interview I think he gives. I know this from a quote in one of Jim Cobb's books. But Walker Percy talks about this worry that he has about the South becoming what he calls a Los Angeles, Dallas, Atlanta axis. But to me, it's that notion has always stuck me because this is the moment in time in which Hollywood is creating this new, happy, playful version of the South with things like the Dukes of Hazzard, with things like Smokey and the Bandit, where the Southerner is no longer what he was a decade before with all the films that are being made in the Civil Rights Movement during that era. But the South has become this place full of fun-loving, hard drinking, hard partying, good old boys. It's fun. It's the fun place. Why is it, y'all think, that in this moment in time we're initially talking about during everyone's boyhood, the South did exist as this place of fun and good times and hard drinking and partying? Why was that the image of the South that was presented? And then we're going to work backwards in time some and look at other ways it was presented on screen. Why was that the cultural work, the cultural image that Hollywood wanted to create of what the South was during the 70s and 80s, this fun-loving place?
Well, Matt, I think some of it goes back to Jimmy Carter. Remember the environment that he's being elected president into. Coming out of Watergate, all the protests and unrests, coming out of Vietnam, the civil rights movement. Americans turn to and elect this guy with a big smile. He's a farmer. He's a Baptist Sunday school teacher who seems to represent kind of a return to normalcy for a lot of Americans, or at least they're hoping it will be a return to normalcy. Being able to put all of this unrest, all of the chaos behind us. And, ultimately, looking ahead, we know that it's not really going to work out that way for them. But I think it also allowed kind of a return to the center of American cultural life for the South. And Jimmy Carter represented to many Americans, everything that was good about the South, with him and his big smile, even with his brother, Billy, with his eponymous beer brand that became a cultural phenomena for a while. People could look at Jimmy Carter and think of a South that didn't necessarily conjure up all these images of Mississippi burning, like Robert referenced from the previous decade.
Yeah, I mean, I for a variety of reasons, but I think Carter is maybe, is he a product of this change in attitude, or does he help himself change the attitude, or is it a little bit of both? But, I do think that at some time around that mid 70s to late 70s period, there is this perception, and certainly Carter benefits from it as, of the South as this kind of wholesome. It's a kind of, I guess we might call it kind of this middle American wholesomeness that maybe a lot of people in America and in the country at large had kind of felt disconnected to. And certainly, as Sean says, the trauma of the 60s and the early 70s had left a lot of people, feeling like America had lost its innocence. And so in some ways, this latching on to the South might represent, subconsciously, I guess, the South represents this kind of, in people's minds, maybe this oasis of wholesomeness, which again is kind of strange if you think about it, because literally just 10 years before that, most people wouldn't have associated those kind of things with the South. What strikes me as really interesting is how quickly that kind of transition must have taken place in people's imaginations.
I'm curious, because you've been talking about Smokey and the Bandit, how much does Burt Reynolds' massive success in the 70s carry some of this? It was he, because he made several movies where it's Southern themed. He plays Southern characters, and were people just kind of latching on to this great new actor with a very colorful personality and writing scripts that would kind of play to his strengths, or was he driving that at all? Obviously Carter is a big influence, but culturally, how important was Burt Reynolds in bringing the sort of lovable, good old boy to the public's attention?
Yeah, well, obviously, I think it's a huge part of it. Burt Reynolds he really was a great actor, and he was a massive celebrity in the 70s. And you're right. You mentioned like White Lightning and Gator. these movies that he had done before Smokey and the Bandit. And if you've ever seen those movies, it's a little bit of a contrast to Smokey and the Bandit. White Lightning, it's this gritty story where Burt Reynolds gets out of prison and he's trying to basically help the feds bust a bootleg ring. And it's if no one's ever seen that movie, I highly recommend it, because it's really a gritty kind of crime drama, whereas Gator is a little bit more pointing towards Smokey and the Bandit in that it's not quite slapstick comedy, but there's a lot of goofiness in it. And you can kind of maybe see a progression in those films. But again, these are definitely movies that are in which you've got Southern villains, but you've also got Southern heroes.
Right.
And maybe that starts with like Walking Tall with Joe Don Baker, where that's the whole Walking Tall series of movies. Those were huge in the 70s. I still remember growing up in the 80s, and I had friends that loved those movies.
Yeah, I mean, you have with those films, talking about this alternate vision of America that the South in some ways has always been, and that media, particularly visual media, as we're talking about today, has always exploited that. If you're looking at the chaos of, the early 70s, someone like the Buford Pusser story, this is this law and order, simpler America, more virtuous vision of America. He's a real individual, but if he wasn't a real individual, Hollywood would almost have to create him to sort of fit the narrative and the needs of that moment in time.
A couple of years ago, I was traveling through South Tennessee with my wife, who is a little bit younger than I am, and we stopped at this little hole-in-the-wall restaurant on the Courthouse Square in Fayetteville, Tennessee. And they had a photograph of the real Buford Pusser dining in this restaurant, and lots of newspaper clippings of him, shellacked and framed all over the walls. And my dear wife had no idea who he was. So, I had to go back and explain, why this was a big deal and why I was so in awe of, sitting in, perhaps the same booth that Buford Pusser once sat in and ate a hamburger and fries. So yeah, it was a huge cultural moment that has likewise completely passed us.
Y'all were talking about, Smokey and the Bandit, this way in which Burt Reynolds creates this character of the lovable good old boy, and helps to promote and mainstream that and create what that becomes over the ensuing 45 years or so. But soon after this, he's going to be in Deliverance, which is a very, very different fantasy of the South. So if we're staying in the 70s right now, before we go jump to some other places, how does that movie play into this Carter era vision of what South means? I'm just interested in y'all's thoughts on that.
Well, Deliverance comes first, doesn't it?
Oh, I guess it does. Okay. So this is still Nixon era South, huh?
I was thinking about Deliverance because the general feeling on Deliverance seems to be that it was pretty bad for the image of the South. But it is interesting that it's by a Southern author, and all of the characters in the movie are Southern. So it seems that Deliverance is more trying to talk about the differences between city dwellers and kind of the wild mountain people, but unfortunately the antagonists are just so loathsome. They came to kind of embody the darkness of the South in general. I don't know if that was quite the intent.
I mean, everyone knows the movie, but if you read the novel is deeply about the shortcomings and the loathsomeness in some ways of the urbane, the cosmopolitan as well. And about the ways in which they themselves are participating in the very sort of fantasy of South that we're, kind of here talking about. And so their whole going on the bow hunting thing is saying, here's a vision, here's a fantasy, here's a mythology of South that we must participate in. And the reality of place, literally punches them in the jaw in many ways. The film does maybe an okay job of doing that, but, it's not as clear as it is in the novel, at least to my reading of that. I want to jump back some then, because we're looking at the 70s. Let's jump back in time a little bit. You go back to, I started out with D.W. Griffith. You have this great spectacle of Birth of the Nation, still to this day a very controversial movie, but is inescapable with its effect on the history of cinema. And then you get things like, some 9-10 years later, you get this amazing Buster Keaton movie called The General, in which is a silent film that tells this real story from the Civil War, but Keaton intentionally flips it around and tells it from a Southern perspective rather than the Northern perspective that the source material, the memoir that Keaton was working from, was told by a Northern soldier who participated in this great raid of the South and this, trying to steal locomotives from Georgia and everything. Keaton turns it around and tells it from the perspective of a Southerner. And when he's asked about this in the 1960s, near the end of his life, Keaton says, you can't make the Southerners the bad guys. That's just not interesting. And why do you think Keaton, who's very near the end of his life at that moment in time, this is, the civil rights movement is getting off the ground, but it hasn't reached its, full flowering yet, right? This is very late 50s, very early 60s, maybe 1959, 1960. I don't remember the exact date. Why do you think someone like Buster Keaton, I don't know if y'all know that movie, The General, but if you do, or even if you don't, what do you make of this notion where Keaton says you can't make the Southerners the villains? It's just not interesting. And why would Hollywood soon after that envision Southerners as villains so regularly? I'm thinking about something like The Heat of the Night, these films that are all being made in the height of the civil rights movement, something like Mississippi Burning, in the late 1980s. What do you think about that? How the Southerner appears as a villain or a hero, and how does Hollywood use the Southerner as hero and villain for its own purposes, its own way to understand what America means?
Well, it's as easy as having a Nazi villain. It's like it's just the cliche. So I think when you have such an easy fallback at a certain point, it just kind of makes you groan. I think that's what Keaton was getting at. But obviously his advice was not followed because it was so easy. And it's easy to do a Southern villain and also make a Southern villain entertaining. I mean, it must be said.
Do you have an example in mind of a entertaining Southern villain, and what
yes.
about
yes,
what
and
about the Southernness makes him so entertaining?
So my favorite is Robert Mitchum in Cape Fear as Max Cady. Now I would even argue, I mean, he is as vile and despicable a character as you'll ever come across in film. In a way, though, I think Southerners can take a certain pride in Max Cady being Southern, because he is the smartest character in the movie. And I kind of have to suspend my disbelief at him being defeated at the end, because he is so ahead of everyone else and so consummately successful in implementing his plan of revenge. But, I mean, Mitchum, who seems to have had an affinity for Southern characters. He had connections in South Carolina, even though he was born in, I think, Delaware. He played Southern villains and Southern anti-heroes quite well. You could do a whole episode just on those movies. And he does, I don't know how technically passable his accent is in Cape Fear, but he was so good at making everything sound natural that I'm completely buying him as a Southerner, maybe not necessarily from the Cape Fear region. Yeah, so that's the thing, though. I mean, you have a character like that, and you could have set that movie somewhere else. In fact, the novel it's based on is not set in the South. But adding that accent and kind of his sociopathic Southern charm on top of the just general villainy of that character makes him probably my favorite screen villain of all time. And it wouldn't be that easy if he was from, say, Minnesota. Like, you should have less material to work with there.
Sociopathic Southern Charm sounds like the name of a band, or at least it should be.
Yes.
You bring up accents. This is the thing that, to me, has always driven me nuts about Southerners being presented in films. My wife and I are big baseball fans, and some years ago, we said, we've never seen Bull Durham. This is this great movie of, baseball, right? Takes place in Durham. Most of it's filmed in Raleigh. The Bar fight scene at the beginning, if you remember, or near the beginning, if you remember that was filmed in Mitch's Tavern in Raleigh, North Carolina. You know, the first place I ever legally drank alcohol. And so I really want to like this movie. But every time Susan Sarandon comes on screen, her accent is so bad, I just want to poke my eardrums out with pencils, right? So I can never finish that movie. And to this day, me, this big baseball fan, everybody says this is the greatest baseball movie ever. I cannot watch that movie because of how bad Susan Sarandon's accent is. So there's, but that kind of points to something. Accents become a way into the participating into and a way of creating the fantasy of Southernness. Susan Sarandon's horrible accent is in some ways, I guess, to show Southern womanhood as something elegant and licentious simultaneously, if that's fair. And that's why it comes off so ridiculously. But then you go look back to the history of cinema, and Southern accents mean different things at different times. In the late 1930s into the 1940s, you know, the Southern accent is a sign of charm and sophistication, like Gone with the Wind. But then by the time you get to the mid to late 1950s, in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, the people with Southern accents are the villains, right? The most quintessential example of this is the film version of To Kill a Mockingbird, where Gregory Peck never tries to sound like a Southerner. Maybe it's just Gregory Peck just doing what felt most natural to him as an actor, but at the same time, there seems to be almost a conscientious artistic choice in his avoiding a Southern accent because of the fact that that helped to show he was the hero. He was the good guy in that moment in time, like in that film.
That's true of Cape Fear as well. He's also the protagonist and far less interesting than the villain. But yeah, I don't know what the reason was for that.
I think that was probably just a choice on the part of Gregory Peck would be my guess, going back and looking at other of his films over his career. He also starred in well, of course, it's an old film. It has Gregory Peck in it, but Horatio Hornblower,
yeah,
in which he plays the great British naval captain, and he plays it straight with his normal Gregory Peck American accent. He doesn't even attempt an English accent. So I think that might just be his own personal preferences.
I guess so. That would make sense. But then I'm struck by how, you know, the bad guys, the villains in that film, all have Southern accents. So the way in which Southern accents play, as maybe, you know, Gregory Peck is just playing it straight because this is how he is one of the great leading men of all time, can do whatever he pleases. But I just can't, I'm always kind of taken by the way in which you go from 1939 and Scarlett O'Hara being played by Vivian Leigh, this English woman putting on a, I think, very respectable Southern accent, to this next really great manifestation of the South on screen in To Kill a Mockingbird. The hero is the one in which the Southern accent is absent, right? And how the Southern accent... But then you jump forward to the time where we began the conversation in the 1970s and 1980s. Southern accents are a good thing. It's a sign that these guys are the heroes. They're the representatives of, you know, the simpler, you know, America of Jimmy Carter, the better, the more virtuous America of Jimmy Carter. So the way in which accents appear or don't appear is, to me, something that it seems like Hollywood has always intentionally played with to help make sense of how the South should be understood, how it, that is Hollywood, wants the South to be understood by its audience.
Well, yeah, I mean, the accent is used either, I mean, it's, as you say, either to denote a villain, but also just, you know, to denote somebody that's dumb or ignorant or simple-minded in some ways. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I'm sitting here and thinking about, I'm trying to catalog all the films I can think of that are set in the South. And, but, you know, now that you think about it, there's a lot of films, as you say, going back to Birth of Nation, and it really is interesting to think how the South as a character or as an essential element of films really has kind of ebbed and flowed throughout the history of American cinema. And it definitely is the case that in certainly in many of these films where, you know, the way that the South and Southerners are portrayed is part of the story, and it does try to say something. And so, I mean, I'm just sort of articulating what we're talking about in general, but it is a reflection of the way that, you know, the filmmakers and if we want to say the filmmakers are the American consciousness to some degree, that they are using the South as a kind of mirror to reflect back on American society in general, to the extent that filmmakers are trying to make a statement with a film. I mean, as we have maybe said before, you know, the South is the great American other. So it's something you either identify with or you kind of define yourself against. I'm trying to think of a film in which the South just kind of is. It's not good. It's not bad. It just, you sort of take it as a given. And for most of these 20th century films, I don't think I can think of one that's like that.
Well, Jeff, so I'm so glad you said that, because one of the other things I wanted to bring up is how the Black Southern experience is depicted in film. And, you know, I hesitate to talk about it because I'm not sure if I can discuss it without sounding like an idiot, but, you know, it seems like the Black Southern experience is typically a plot point, right? It's kind of a focal point for some atrocity. And much like you're trying to imagine some film that just kind of lets the South be, at one point, if any, do we start seeing just the Black Southern experience being depicted on its own, you know, not as some turning point of the movie.
Right.
And I think that there's stuff happening now. I know that there's a television series about Atlanta, but did it take all the way up till now? I mean, what was there? Can you guys think of anything?
There's one film I would it's one of my favorite Southern movies, and that's Sounder.
Mm-hmm.
From I think it's from 1972.
Okay.
I don't have any of you ever seen Sounder?
No,
I haven't.
Yeah, it's a great movie, and in fact, I think it was highly praised at the time. But yeah, it pretty much centers the I mean, I say the African American experience. It's the story about a Black family in Louisiana. They're sharecroppers, and it's a story about a boy and his dog. And I mean, I don't want to sort of recapitulate the movie, but I mean, it's just a great movie that features mostly African American characters. There is a good white character, and then there's lots of bad white characters, but the bad white characters are the police, who end up arresting the boy's father because he stole some ham out of well, you don't see him doing it, but you assume he did it, and ends up going to a work camp in the 1930s. It's set during the Depression. But it's to me, it's if you're looking for a film that kind of does that to some degree, I mean, an older film, that's one I would put out there.
Yeah, and Rob, I mean, I can think of there was an art house film from the mid '90s called Daughters of the Dust. That's about the Gullah Geechee people on the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia that does that exact thing. But to do what you're talking about, it has to take this very particular and very historically contextualized and shaped part of the Black Southern experience, that is the Gullah Geechee people, who are in many ways isolated from other parts of the wider South for historical and geographic reasons, to kind of explore that. But that and this film Sounder, which I haven't seen, these seem to be the things that for most, the things that most recently come to mind, where I think your point stands. It is something where the Black South, Hollywood is seemingly always imagining the Black South as simply, well, Hollywood is regularly imagining the Black South as simply this thing that is reacting to the White South, instead of something with its own genius and its own character. And maybe we are seeing it, different things now with, shows like Atlanta and, some similar things that are coming out in recent days. There was another sort of art house film, Beast of the Southern Wild, which kind of did a similar thing. But it's interesting that I'm saying all these ones I can think of to answer your question, Rob, they're all art house films, and how that presentation of the South is distinct from the mainstream Hollywood presentation of the South. You did ask a question, is the South ever presented simply just as? And the only film I can think of that does something similar to this is this Ronald Reagan movie from 1940 called Santa Fe Trail. Have you ever seen this?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So if you haven't, it's this kind of weird movie that anachronistically imagines Jeb Stuart and George Armstrong Custer as classmates at West Point, even though they were 7 or 8 years apart in actual age. But imagine them as classmates at West Point, and then them both going to Bleeding Kansas to arrest John Brown. Ronald Reagan plays Custer, and Errol Flynn plays Jeb Stuart. And in that, you have a vision of, the South is a place that is distinct, but is still completely American. And there's this, it's this film that imagines the tragedy of the unwinding of America into North and South, right? Instead of this one unified place. It's not a perfect movie, but it's kind of hokey in places, but it does this really interesting job of imagining the South in the context of a broader American ideal, in this post Gone with the Wind, leading up to World War II moment, through this, again, purposefully ahistorical imagining of Custer and Stewart as West Point classmates. The movie's in the public domain. You can find it on the internet for free. It's not on copyright anymore. It's worth watching if you've never seen it.
I was going to say, do any of y'all have a favorite 21st century Southern movie?
Well, is this where I can talk about Justified? It's not really a movie.
Yeah, go ahead. Talk about Justified, Rob.
Yeah. So Justified is my favorite of what I've seen, because I know there's plenty of stuff out there I haven't seen, but it is my favorite filmed story that's set in the South. And, it's based on a character and a couple stories by Elmore Leonard. And so it has there's a pulp fiction-y aspect to the story. And in real life, you wouldn't have a officer of the law who would be able to rack up quite so large a body count and still keep his job. But apart from the somewhat sensational crime drama, the characters in Justified and the locale, to me, feel really authentic. And it's interesting because it was not filmed in the South at all. It was filmed in California, a small town in California. I can't remember the name. The people that did the show, it seemed like they tried a little bit harder than you usually see. In the cast, you've got Walton Goggins, who's great in everything he does. He's especially good sort of in the sometimes villain, sometimes anti-hero in Justified. And he's from Birmingham. Nick Searcy is one of the primary actors, who is the harried supervisor of kind of the lone wolf, Raylan, who's the main character. But Nick is from North Carolina. And then Joelle Carter, who's one of the primary love interests, is from Georgia. So now you will notice, I don't know if I mentioned, the show is set in Kentucky, and you'll notice in that list that there's not a soul from Kentucky, but at least it seems like, although they're not quite hitting the target there, they're hitting the region with their cast, and there's just a lot of attention to detail in this show that for me really rings true. So have you guys seen Justified? I've only seen the first 2 seasons, but I just think it's a tremendous show.
I've only seen a handful of episodes of it, and I agree that with your assessment that yes, it's a wonderful show.
It's on my list.
It seems to present a almost darkly realistic portrayal of the South.
How so, Sean?
Perhaps realistic, in an artistic or literary sense, almost to the point of, I don't know, perhaps romanticizing the realism, perhaps overstating the realism. Just the general atmosphere of it, with well, with the violence, for instance. It reminded me a little in terms of atmosphere with a really good movie came out just a few years ago, Mudbound, about these two rural Mississippi families, one white and one black, who are neighbors, and they both have sons come home as veterans from World War II, and it's about the radically different experiences, in large part these two veteran sons have, largely because of racial issues going on there. But again, it's I would almost describe it as like hyper realistic, if you will, almost in Quentin Tarantino sort of way.
Yeah, one other thing so I agree with that. I think that's romanticized realism, which seems like such a contradiction, but that's absolutely true. I mean, that's as I mentioned, there's a higher body count than you would hopefully ever see in a town that size, in Justified, and certainly at the hands of a couple characters. But the violence, although there's a lot of violence, the violence itself is not really romanticized. It's pretty brutal. The one other thing, and Jeff, this is a reason I think you're really going to enjoy it, is the main character, Raylan, who's played by Timothy Oliphant, who's not Southern, but he's such a wonderful actor, and he just really blends right in with this, and you immediately buy him. When the series starts out, I think he's working in Miami. He really wanted to get out of Kentucky. He had some, I guess, shame or about being from Kentucky, and maybe about his Southernness, and he's really getting his law enforcement career going in Miami, but some of his old sort of Wild West type habits cause him to be politely sent back where he came from. And the show really sensitively explores his feelings about where he's from, and also his gradual embracing of it, and realizing that this is actually the only place he truly can be at home. And it's those kind of quiet aspects of the show that contrast with that sometimes disturbing violence. The show spends a lot of time on that quietness as well. And that's why I think it's just a great show. And it's something that, you can watch with a partner who may not be into action type stuff, and you're both going to get a lot out of it. So I highly recommend it.
As we're coming up on time here, gentlemen, I do want to bring up something I think it was Jeff said a bit earlier about the South as a character. And you think about that, and you think about how, well, the elephant in the room we haven't discussed is we're talking about film. We're talking about a visual medium, and so how the South looks on the screen. And this is intriguing to me because Rob mentioned, Justified, this show that he's been talking about as this great contemporary expression and presentation of the South on screen. It is filmed in a small town in California, not a town in the South. Famously, when Selznick, wants to film Tara, from my understanding is he sends someone down to Georgia to go find a plantation to use at filming, and they can't find one that actually looks the way he thinks it should look. So as y'all know, maybe y'all know, do y'all know what Tara actually was in Gone with the Wind in the film?
What wasn't the outside of it a plantation around Charleston?
No, it was a painting.
Oh, was it?
It was a massive painting. It's essentially, 1930s green screen technology. They just make a massive painting and just film in front of that. Similarly, when this Buster Keaton movie I love, The General, which is supposed to take place in Georgia, north of Atlanta, Keaton goes to start filming there in North Georgia, and he says, this doesn't look right. So the movie is filmed in Oregon because Oregon looks the way the South is supposed to look. So I'm just really interested by the way in which Hollywood, which does so much to create our fantasies of the South, seems to Hollywood that seems to want to display the South is always deeply dissatisfied with the reality of how the South looks, right? And what the South actually is. So I'm just curious as to what y'all's, thinking about, about that is and why that might be and how that might help us make sense of how the South on screen works culturally. This fact that, so often things set in the South are never actually filmed in the South. There's always a fantasy version of the South that can never actually be aligned with the reality of the place.
Well, Deliverance, getting back to Deliverance, that was definitely filmed in Georgia. Although, to sort of illustrate again what you're talking about, I think that first season of Dukes of Hazzard was filmed around Atlanta, but then after that, everything was in California. So yeah, I mean that's an interesting point. I mean, is there something about the actually filming on location that gives a film a certain verisimilitude that it wouldn't otherwise have?
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Deliverance is the place where the film where it was recorded on location. And that is this, as we've discussed, this very negative presentation of the South, when these romantic presentations of the South, these more positive presentations of it, become merely the fantasies. And so how that works is pretty interesting to me.
Although I will say, though, I mean, Deliverance is a beautifully shot movie.
Oh, yes. It's gorgeous to look at.
And just the soundscape in that movie, it's a luxuriant movie. And of course, that primal nature, I mean, nature is this primal force that in many ways, that's the main character of the movie, I think. To me, Deliverance is, I think there's this urban versus rural, New South versus Old South subtext. But I've always sort of seen it as this sense of civilization versus, wildness or barbarism, those kind of themes that he's playing with. And if that interpretation is correct, then certainly the North Georgia mountains and the river and all this sort of primal nature certainly, again, to me is the real star of the movie.
Well, I think Jeff makes a good point about Deliverance and the portrayal of nature. There have been, a handful of movies that I can think of, where Western North Carolina and the mountains there have stood in as not just an important backdrop, but, filled in almost as part of the story itself. Even like, famously in Last of the Mohicans, which isn't set in the South, but is filmed there. Those Western North Carolina mountains play a huge role in it. Or I suppose on the other extreme, you've got in sort of the Southern fantasy, Big Fish. I don't know if any.
Oh yeah. That's what I'm
based on kind of the magic realism novel of Daniel Wallace by the same name. I'm pretty sure it was filmed on location at a ghost town in Alabama.
Yeah, one of my favorite contemporary presentations of the South is this tragic comedy, romantic tragedy, romantic comedy kind of mashup called Junebug from about 15 years ago, which is this story of a Southerner who's gone to Chicago, and then a series of events leads him back south. And this is actually filmed on location in, the Piedmont of North Carolina. And there's this shot at the end of it when he, the main character, and his fiance, this high-class, sophisticated woman from Chicago, are leaving and driving back. And the exit they pass is the exit my wife and I used to get off to go to her parents' house. And it's always kind of stuck with me. And just because of how familiar it felt and how real that felt. And it points exactly to what some of y'all being said seem to be getting at here. The South, when it's presented as is, becomes the main character of the film more than anything else. Yeah. The landscape comes to dominate. And so when you have these other films where you can't let the place become the main character, either because there's a story you have to tell about the place beyond what the place itself in reality is, you have to take it somewhere else to kind of change the story. So it's interesting, the South, which is very often thought of via its landscape, when the landscape is presented, the South itself, the South qua the South, is inescapably the central character in that drama, which is just fascinating to me. Rob?
I don't know if, I mean, that's beautiful. I don't know if I have that much to add to what you said. I guess it's sort of a coda to something Sean said. You guys probably know that there's a real thriving film industry in North Carolina now. And so now things have really turned where the South is standing in for a lot of other locations. There's a massive studio in Wilmington. Blue Velvet was filmed in Wilmington. The Blue Velvet is not set in the South at all. I don't know if you guys remember, I just learned this, but the movie from the 80s, the Mickey Rourke movie, Year of the Dragon, that was filmed. They basically rebuilt Manhattan in a field in North Carolina. They filmed the whole thing there. And I guess that tells you how expensive it must be to film in Manhattan. So I think with as far as the locations, we might have been overthinking things a little bit. I mean, part of it is there's the director with the vision and they can't find a plantation they like. And so they construct it or they use a painting or whatever. But a lot of times it comes down to, I think with Justified, I suspect it was cheaper to film where everyone lived, some of these other movies, I mean, Robert Mitchum's Thunder Road, that was filmed in the South. So I think it just kind of comes down to tax breaks and convenience, sometimes more than some overarching aversion to filming stuff in the South. Rob,
let me be an English major and just think about these things abstractly and poetically and not by the basics of tax policy and cost. Come on, man, come on. No, but your point stands. Yeah. I think your point stands, and I think it's a very, very good one. Sean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was going to say there's a huge film industry in Atlanta too.
Yep.
Atlanta, filling in for all kinds of places. I believe some of the Marvel movies have been filmed there. So, Atlanta's probably even filling in for different planets. Or my oldest daughter just recently graduated from Agnes Scott College in Atlanta. And I know their campus had, been frequently used as a filming location and filled in as, various universities around the world.
In my part of Georgia, this is where The Walking Dead has been filmed. I drive past Walking Dead sets all the time around here, or drive past them, yeah.
So what is that vision of the South, Jeff? And I think this is a great place to kind of end it today, in the post-apocalyptic world. How does that television show, is there something other than just the sort of happenstance of location? Is there something specifically Southern about that show? Does its Southern setting lend some sort of artistic credence to what that show is trying to do?
I have to admit that I watched like the first 3 seasons of The Walking Dead and they just got frustrated with it. But, it was interesting to me because at the time it started, there was another show out on AMC, Hell on Wheels, that had a former Confederate who was helping build the Transcontinental Railroad. And it struck me at the time that you had these 2 shows that were kind of contemporaneous, where you had these 2 leading Southern male characters as being essentially, again, this kind of heroic figure. From my understanding, the graphic novel that The Walking Dead is based on is set in the South, it's set exactly where the TV show sets it, in Georgia. And it maybe the creators of that are, what's the main character's name again? I'm blanking out, but
Rick.
Rick, yeah. He's another Buford Pusser. He's Buford Pusser 3.0. That's sort of the impression I got. They were, it seems to me they were going for that same sort of character and that same sort of, vibe with his character, although in a certainly different kind of world than the one that Buford Pusser inhabited. But it may go back to that notion of the South as kind of primal. If you're going to create a raw post-apocalyptic world after a zombie apocalypse, why not set it in the South?
The South is primal. The South is the American other. The South is the romantic fantasy. All these different visions of the South have been presented to us by television and filmmakers over the last 110 years. and we hope will continue to be used in nuanced and complex ways for the next 110 years. Sean Busick, Jeff Rogers, Robert Dean Lurie, thank y'all for joining me today. And for our listeners, thank y'all for listening. And until next time, y'all take it easy.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.